So I want to react to this interview, this clip that I saw of Raymond Ibrahim. Raymond Ibrahim is a historian. He's an author. He specializes in Islamic history, and he goes to the primary sources. He speaks Arabic. He reads the original texts, and what he says in this clip is very important. But I also want to add a layer to his argument that I think makes it even more relevant and more powerful, more important for us to hear. So let's keep that in mind as we watch. I'll stop the video at a couple places to share my thoughts. Okay, so let's head over to Raymond now. Here we go.
If you had to put forward a thesis about how the West should think about Islam, what would it be?
The thesis would be that Islam is not just another religion. It's an entire coherent political system. A lot of people are approaching Sharia, which is usually loosely translated as Islamic law, and they have no problem condemning it. A lot of Americans, Greg Abbott, Trump, Abbott said like there's no room for Sharia in Texas, for example. Mm-hmm. And that's all well and good. But I think as people start learning, well, guess what? Sharia and Islam are inherently the same. I call one Islam the descriptive name of the religion, and Sharia is the prescriptive application. So I guess that would be my ultimate thesis, which is, maybe you see what Sharia is, maybe you don't like it, maybe you find it incompatible with the West. But guess what? That's not just some weird accretion that some radicals do. That is Islam.
All right.
Okay, this is super important. Super, super important. And I want to make sure this point is understood. He's drawing a distinction that most Western commentators just miss. Like he brings up like Greg Abbott criticizing Sharia. When politicians say we don't want Sharia in Texas, but they think that they're criticizing some fringe interpretation or more radical interpretation of a religion called Islam, right? Some sort of extremism that has been grafted on to an otherwise peaceful religion. And as he says right at the beginning there, Islam is a system of governance, okay? He's saying something very fundamental. He's saying that Sharia is Islam. It's not separable from it. Islam as a descriptor is the name of the religion. Sharia is the practical governing implementation. Islam means submission. What are you submitting to? You're submitting to the will of Allah. The will of Allah is expressed in Sharia. That's what Sharia is. It's merely the implementation of Islam. You can't accept one and reject the other. They are the same thing. A good way to understand this would be with a comparison to Judaism. We could also compare it to Christianity. Jewish law, it's called halakha, is extraordinarily detailed and comprehensive. It governs diet, family life, commerce, civil disputes, everything. It's at least as comprehensive as Sharia in its scope. But, and this is critical, it's explicitly and theologically limited, bounded in a very specific way. It governs Jews. It makes no claim to govern non-Jews. It has no aspiration of governing non-Jews. And this is very important because if the only people it governs are the people who want it and who choose it, people who choose it, who want it, those are the people that it governs, then it's not seeking conquest. It's not seeking governance of anyone else's life. Yes, Judaism has a concept in it called the Noahide laws, which are really just these 7 basic moral principles. That is what Judaism seeks from all of humanity, but not as governance. It doesn't seek to implement these things. Judaism is not a universalist governing project. It seeks to govern the Jewish people in the Jewish homeland. There are some laws that apply outside the Jewish homeland to Jews only, and others that apply only in the Jewish homeland, but that it seeks only to govern the Jewish people. Now, Christianity, similarly, and I want to be precise here because this is important, Christianity theologically makes no claim to govern. Yes, it's true the Catholic Church accumulated enormous temporal power at various points in history. There were crusader states and papal kingdoms, but that was an institutional overreach. It wasn't theological doctrine. Okay, show me where in the Gospels and the epistles and the core theological framework of Christianity that there's a mandate to establish Christian governance over non-Christians. Okay, it's just not there. Render unto Caesar, that famous line, is in fact the opposite impulse. The Great Commission is about conversion through preaching, not through conquest. Islam is different at the source, from the earliest texts, from Muhammad's own political and military consolidation of Arabia. The theological and governmental are fused. The theological and the governmental, they're inseparable. That's Ibrahim's point, and it's well documented in the primary sources. It's key to understanding what Islam actually is. What is the aspiration of the quote unquote faith? Its aspiration is governance. And that's why it is a political project, as Ibrahim calls it. That is not an epithet. It's not an insult. And it's not false. Okay. It is a governing project. We have to be aware of that.
So when I'm reading the stuff you write, when I hear you talk on the internet, there feels like a sense of a warning that you're giving the West about Islam, that we're not taking it seriously enough, something along those lines. Does that feel fair?
From the very beginning of Islam in the 7th century, after Muhammad dies and Arabia is consolidated under the banner of Islam, they go on the jihad, according to Islamic teaching. And in 1 century, from the death of Muhammad, 632 to 732, they literally have conquered 3/4 of the Christian world, which most people have no idea about, okay? When people hear of countries like Egypt and Syria or Turkey, they just have in their mind this vague idea that they were always either Muslim or kind of Eastern. Yeah. No, they were actually, if you went in the 7th century, Christianity was more ingrained in Egypt, in Turkey, in Syria, in Morocco, Mauritania, and in Tunisia. You know, the father of Western theology, Augustine, he's from Tunisia. He's a North African. He was a Berber. Okay, and most of the early fathers were Egyptians and Syrians and so forth. And you had 5 sees, 5 major centers. One was Rome. The other 4, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Constantinople, all got conquered by Islam. So it was a long, constant war that went on literally for over a millennium, okay, century after century, whenever Muslims could. Obviously, there were times when it was an ebb and flow, and due to the vicissitudes of circumstances and Muslims weren't strong enough, they wouldn't attack. But any such time that they were strong, they conquered. So I just told you, I gave you the date, 732, 1 century, because that's the Battle of Tours, and that's where Islam has finally stopped in the center of France. Spain has now been conquered. All of North Africa has been conquered. The greater Middle East has been conquered. And then later, Turkey gets conquered, which is one of the most ancient Christian regions. That's where St. Paul sent many of his letters. It features in the book of Revelation. There was a long, constant war and annexation of Christian territories by Islam, historically, just as a fact. And why did they do it? So even if you find a historian who is willing to talk about this, they'll give them their national names. Okay, they'll talk about the Arab conquest. They'll talk about the Moors in Spain. They'll talk about the Turks, and they'll talk about the Tatars and the Mongols. They'll call them Saracens. And when you hear it that way, as I did in college, you're prone to just think, okay, these are different warring groups, just like in Europe. The French and the English are warring. There's no ideological component necessarily. But if you dig into the sources, as I have, the primary sources, including from the Muslim sources, they see themselves not necessarily as Turks or Arabs, but as Muslims, first and foremost. And their rationale for war on whoever, let's say the Christians, is you're an infidel. And, that's the rule of Islam. And we have to attack you and give you the 3 choices: convert, die, or pay tribute and be a second-class citizen, et cetera, et cetera. And so my point is, it was a long, constant, massive war that went on that swallowed up most of the Christian West. Okay. We call.
Okay, this is huge. This is a absolutely huge, huge point. So what he's doing here, he's stripping away the national labels that historians use. And it's so important that we do this, because as he explains, when we study history and we call it the Arab conquest, or we talk about the Moors and the Saracens and the Turks and the Tatars, we think about it as these different historical nations and different groups and different we lose the continuity of it. That's the point. And what he's doing here is he's forcing us, he's saying, call them all Muslims, because that's how they identified themselves. Look at the common ideological thread. And when you read the primary sources, as he has, the actors themselves don't primarily identify as Saracens or Arabs or Turks, etc. They identify as Muslims. And the justification for war is theological. It's not ethnic or national. It's the jihad. And here's where I want to add something that he doesn't talk about in this clip. So when we talk about the Ottoman Empire that existed for 400 years, from the early 1500s to the early 20th century. He doesn't say this in this clip, but the Ottoman Empire, which was the caliphate, it was the last continuous institutional expression of the Muslim project. The Muslim project, what he's describing here. Remember, Islam seeks conquest, and it seeks to bring the world under the governance of Islam. And that governance of Islam is meant to have a caliph who governs the entire world, or the entire Muslim world, whatever's conquered. The caliphate, the Ottoman Empire was the caliphate. It fell in 1924. It was abolished by Ataturk, who was a secularist reformer in Turkey. And while we think that that's a good thing, become more Western, become more open, and a lot of the Ottoman Empire, these Arab countries, which were then taken over briefly by the French and the British, then became somewhat secular states, that's an aberration. It's not like these societies went through the Enlightenment and everything that Europe went through to become modern societies. They did not. The Ottoman Empire fell in 1924. And that meant that for the first time in 13 centuries, there was no more caliph. There was no more caliphate. There was no political religious authority claiming to lead the Muslim world. And only 4 years later, 1928, Hassan al-Banna founds an organization that you've all heard of called the Muslim Brotherhood. He founds it in Egypt. So that's basically immediate. It's a direct response. It's direct organizational response to what they viewed, what many Muslims viewed as a catastrophe, the fall of the caliphate. If you're a Muslim and you believe in the Islamic project, you believe that Sharia should rule the earth, and there's this massive caliphate that governs huge swaths of the earth, and then it falls apart and there's no more Muslim governance, it's a catastrophe. And Hassan al-Banna founds the Muslim Brotherhood, and he framed the mission of the Muslim Brotherhood as the revival and restoration of the caliphate. That's what it seeks to do. So the project of Islam did not end in 1924. It went into retreat, it reorganized, it found a new institutional form, but that's what it is. So I can't stress this enough. When we say that Islam is a political movement, that's not an insult. It's not an epithet. It's literally in the definition of what this faith or what this ideology seeks, what it wants. Going back to what I said about Judaism and Christianity, it seeks governance that makes it political.
You know, we call it the West because it's West of what? Well, West. It was, when we think of the West, now it has its own kind of connotation. But historically, in the medieval era, it was West because it was the westernmost portion of Christianity that didn't get conquered. Okay, it was the final appendage, Europe. And there was a constant warfare, constant struggle that went on. You know, Islamic pirates would go as far as Iceland in the 16th century for raids, and they would come back with loads of slaves. America's first war, most people are unaware, as a nation following independence from Britain, was with Muslims who were again using the same logic. And it's interesting because it comes out in the writings of Thomas Jefferson, this paragon of enlightenment, who had, of course, obviously forgotten about those Muslims and didn't really understand what was going on. But they were enslaving American sailors in their vessels. They would raid them, Muslim pirates from Barbary. And John Adams and Jefferson met with one of the ambassadors from Barbary, And basically, and we have the existing letter where Jefferson wrote a letter to Congress saying what happened in the meeting. And he says, we told him, look, can't we just be friends? We have nothing against you. You can do your religion, and let's engage in trade. Let's help each other. And then Jefferson writes, and the man answered us and said, it's in our Quran. You're the enemy. You're the infidel. We must wage war on you, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So I tell you all that by way to answer your question about the warning. Okay. So this has been going on for over a millennium.
This being, we are ideologically driven. We are going to wage warfare to conquer the infidel.
Right. And we have conquered.
All right. That's the end of the clip. Let me pull that down. So, what strikes me about what he just said there is the consistency across centuries. Right, you have these Barbary pirates who are telling Jefferson and Adams, we're going to wage war against you. You're the infidel. Right, the Barbary ambassador tells Jefferson that it's in the Quran. We're obligated to wage war on you. Right, there's no grievance here. When people in the West have all these theories about why the Muslim world is angry at the West, or why are they against us? Or it's because of Israel, or it's because of Western permissiveness or Western imperialism, or all these reasons that are given, these assumptions that are made by people in the West about why it is that these Islamic societies hate the West. They've been saying the same thing for centuries and centuries. There's no list of political demands that the Barbary pirates had for Jefferson and Adams. There was no negotiation about territory or trade disputes. The justification is purely theological and universal. You exist outside Islam, and that makes you the enemy, and we are obligated by the Quran to wage war against you. That's what they said then. We have to understand that these societies did not go through the Enlightenment. They did not change their thinking along the way. They had a caliphate. The caliphate ended in 1924. And then they went underground and built an organization to try to restore it. So the Muslim Brotherhood produces a thinker named Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb provides the intellectual framework that directly feeds into the creation of Al-Qaeda, of ISIS. Osama bin Laden explicitly cites the theological tradition that Raymond Ibrahim is describing. ISIS in 2014 didn't just commit acts of terrorism. They declared a caliphate. We think of these things as isolated political situations because we Westerners tend to think of history, especially modern history, as compartmentalized. There's these sort of sections of it. And we don't necessarily pay attention to that flow of history, that sweep of history. And certainly in the Middle East and in Islamic society, there is a direct flow, a direct sweep of history. And it's a very unbroken chain. They have this caliphate and this Islamic project to kill the infidel and take over and rule as far as they can get to. 1928 is a catastrophe for them. That's the aberration where suddenly these secularists take over and these Westerners come in and they chop up the Ottoman Empire and they institute these secular governments. Some of them are sort of colonized by the French and the British. That's all an aberration. These guys, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, are consciously and explicitly closing the loop that was opened when Ataturk abolished the caliphate in 1924. They're bringing it back. That is what they are trying to do. This is the through line. Medieval conquest, Ottoman consolidation, right? Medieval conquest of the Christian world, destroying Christian communities all across the Middle East. And that was a great point he made, where we think of Middle Eastern countries as like, oh, they're Islamic, they're non-Christian. We think Christian world in our mind equates with Europe. And what he's saying is that, whoa, that's only the case because the Muslims waged jihad across the Middle East and North Africa and Turkey, and they took over all these countries that were Christian nations. So the Ottomans consolidated. 1924, it collapses. In between that, there's no enlightenment. There's no intellectual progress like we have in the West, that we think of modernity as a different world, as a different mindset, but it's not for them. That's what I'm trying to get across here. Because right away after the Ottoman collapse, the Brotherhood gets founded. Qutb, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the ideological project is identical, hasn't changed at all. They have better weapons, hasn't changed at all. The goals are identical. The theological justification is identical. It's all the same. Look, what Raymond Ibrahim is giving us in this clip is not a conspiracy theory. Understand that. This isn't Islamophobia. He's a historian. This is historically documented. This is a historically documented argument that he's making. It's rooted in primary sources, in the words of the Muslims throughout the ages themselves, across 14 centuries. And the Western mistake, and it's embedded in those words, 14 centuries. Westerners don't think of a sweep of history like that. They think of ancient history 1,000 years ago. It's like not relevant to our time. You're talking about some ancient world that doesn't really exist. That's how Westerners think, but it's not how Muslims think. The Western mistake, and it is a terrible mistake, it is a catastrophic mistake, is to treat each manifestation of this Muslim project as a separate phenomenon. Like ISIS is this situation that happened that we dealt with or are dealing with, and the Muslim Brotherhood is this organization that we're dealing with, and the medieval conquests are just ancient history that don't have relevance. But they're not separate things. They're all part of the same continuum. They're all chapters in the same book. This project has not ended. It was paused, it was reorganized, it adapted to circumstances. But the theological core, the goals, that Islam is not a private faith, but a governing project with universal governing ambitions, that has never changed. Not in the 7th century, not in 1928, not today. And Raymond Ibrahim's contribution is to make you see that, so that once you see it, you know it. Thanks for watching.